Welcome to Score One Talks. My guests for today again are Pastor Tim Nielsen, lead pastor at City Church, and also Sister Sue Nielsen, his wife. Welcome back, Pastor Tim and Sue. It's great to have you. Today's topic again is newcomer integration from a biblical perspective, part 2. And in the last episode of Score One Talk, we all shared about our involvement with newcomers in different places, specifically you with the Naomi house. Can you briefly remind us what Naomi house is all about? Again, a little bit.
Well, it's a 7-bedroom transitional home for newly arriving refugees or asylum seekers, as well as a sponsorship agreement holder with the Canadian government, sponsoring currently about 250 refugees to Canada, and partnering with other evangelical churches in Winnipeg and trying to encourage them in their ministry to newcomers, as well as providing some programming and settlement services for those that we service.
And also you are a sponsorship holder.
That's correct.
Organization,
since 2020.
Since 2020, yeah. Right. Yeah, you, in the first episode, you mentioned that you brought more than 250 people. 250.
They haven't all arrived yet.
They haven't all arrived yet.
But in the process.
Our allocation is about 100 refugees per year.
In the previous episode, we talked about integration in general. And it's very important for newcomers to integrate to Canadian society. But in this one, I would like to go deeper into this topic of integration. Again, I would like to divide this integration from my perspective into the 3 areas. Number 1, I would say it's a limited integration, where 10,000s of immigrants came to Canada during 70s, 80s, 90s, like Chinese, Japanese, German, Vietnamese, Filipino, and others. Could you explain us the type of integration in those decades?
In that time period, there was, within the church, I can speak more of the church than government, there was the theological position of Donald McGavin, who was also known for the church growth movement, and he advocated for the ethnic-specific church model. So you would have and the Alliance were one of the ones that you'll often see the titles of these churches, but others were doing the same as well. So you would see a Chinese Alliance, a Japanese Alliance, a First Nations Alliance. Each of those were meant to be a strategy to reach within the group, but they also created isolationism from each other and from the church at large.
Yes, when I went to your website, City Church, you say City Church is an intercultural.
Yes, intentionally intercultural church is the term.
Intentionally intercultural. We talked briefly before this episode that we mentioned that multiculturalism is a part of Canadian Charter of Rights in 1982. What is the difference between multiculturalism and intercultural?
Well, it's a great question, and to me, I would picture it kind of like a circle, multicultural, and in it you have other circles of culture groups. So the church that's multicultural, it's all within that church, but they exist, but they're not interacting with each other. Intercultural is where those cultural groups are interlocked between each other. There's interaction going on. There's a relationship between the culture groups, and so they are intercultural in that sense. And then I'd layer that with one more word, and that's intentionally intercultural, and that is promoting and encouraging the intercultural church all the way up through the leadership of the church, so that the church is being represented by all culture groups in it.
Yeah. Do you think these were like a Chinatown? Or these times, this came from that?
Yes, it probably did. It certainly was along the same thinking of ethnic communities and then ethnic-specific churches, and each of these churches not being able to relate to the other. But that's not what we see in the New Testament. We see the Hellenistic Jews along with the Hebraic Jews integrating together.
That's right, yes. And coming back to this multiculturalism thing, I know in those decades when immigrants or refugees will come, they usually start a beginner job or entry-level jobs. Unless they had, a few of them, they had businesses that they start, but majority of them, they start working in McDonald's, Tim Hortons, just an entry-level job or cleaning. And that's a different. And the government, what basically at that time was doing, they make sure that they follow the law. The law and rules. And they don't break the law, that's good. But we all know that with the influx of new immigrants or refugees in Canada for last decades, it's impossible. Now it's impossible to be like that. In other words, what I'm getting is that even the Charter of Rights has to be updated because multiculturalism in that initial understanding of pockets of culture in each area specific doesn't work anymore. It is now more intercultural anyway. And what you're saying is it has to be intentional. I really like intentional intercultural efforts. Yes. Yeah. Do you agree that should group of people work to change the word multiculturalism Charter of Rights?
Well, I'm not a politician, but I would say that the Canadian government made a good move forward by acknowledging multicultural, and certainly intercultural is what we ought to be aiming for. And our schools are that way. I mean, the children go to school, they're not segregated by classrooms, by their culture. They're integrated there. They're integrated in the workplace, and I think the church needs to be an integrated place as well.
Although, in some of those decades, there were kind of some like German schools.
There was. There
were some of those things.
Yeah, but currently they're not. They're not.
If we're isolated like this, then we have misconceptions about each other, and then misunderstandings develop, and division, and then a small thing can erupt into a big thing because you misunderstand each other and don't have relationships between the different ethnic groups and multicultural groups. And if we can be intercultural, then we can work out those differences sooner and easier. And of course, like in the church, born again believers have the Holy Spirit, which unifies us, and that makes it more possible.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
That's what limited integration, what I call this first one. And then the second one, what I call it, government/public integration. When refugees, immigrants, they come, they have to follow certain rules, they have to fill some forms, health card, they have to school. It's a force. Basically, they have to do these things. Describe us that some of the style of integration during this period. What is some challenges on those ones, like in the last 10 years?
I can't speak so much for government. I can speak more for church.
That's right.
So, but certainly when the period of multicultural, when churches began to change and began to realize that it's good to have people of different ethnic backgrounds there, they were brought into the church but with a glass ceiling. So they weren't able to penetrate leadership, they weren't able to penetrate in. And I think that's so sad because these churches were missing the spiritual giftings of these newcomers, the abilities, the perspective, the theology, and it's almost like they weren't trusting them. And it's so tragic because they were missing a blessing there. In fact, I know of some churches that refused to even have newcomers in the community that they had. They had a certain ethnic group around them. Programs were being run in their church, but they refused to reach out to that ethnic group because they didn't want to integrate, and they were afraid of losing their value, and that was very sad. They missed the blessing.
Exactly.
And quite honestly, those churches, I wonder if they'll survive. ultimately.
Specifically for the second or third generation.
Yeah.
The third style of integration, what I call it deep biblical integration.
Right.
Deep biblical integration. Here, like Leviticus 19, 33, 34, it says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Basically, God says, I rescued you from the Egypt. At the same time, you helped these refugees. Or here is another one from Leviticus 24, 22. It says, there shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. Basically, no stereotype, no looking down.
Right.
The problem of looking down is that, or a stereotype is, as one culture or one ethnic group, they start stereotyping others or looking down, it also can backfire. Then the other minority ethnic groups also, they start looking down.
Right.
Or a stereotype. For example, if, let's say, Caucasian, if like they make fun of, for example, my English or accent.
Right.
We have accent. Then we will have a way also to make fun on something else.
Right.
To backfire this.
Right.
That's a important issue. And Pastor Tim, how does your work at Naomi House and also the City Church, you call it intentional intercultural, reflects the kind of deep biblical integration described in these verses?
Well, let's take a Sunday morning at City Church. So from the pulpit, it is integrated, not just, so we're integrated on leadership, but we're also integrated on the pulpit. So we share the pulpit with people. I don't do exclusive preaching. We have others preach from different ethnic backgrounds. If sometimes we will have translation going on, and so that we can understand, but we allow and invite, in fact, invite and encourage speakers of other languages to preach, and then we are blessed by hearing their message translated. We also have translation equipment that is infrared, the same equipment that's used for hard of hearing in churches.
You do a live translation?
Yeah, live translation. We've done more in the past, but we had at one point 3 stations with 3 different languages. Right now we have 1 language. The difficulty there is that it's hard for us to find translators because biblical language to translate is much different than conversational, and so it's difficult to find those. We're not a big church. We're I would say on the smaller side.
Yeah, that's why sometimes when I go to different churches to preach, then if they have a translator, then they ask my notes ahead of time.
Yes, always
that they can give the translator.
Yeah, and that's what we always do. We provide the notes. Then we also have special music. Pretty much every week we have special music in another language, and then with PowerPoint. We have it in English.
But when you say other language, the main is English. Then what other language?
It would be Karen or Chin or Swahili or Eritrean, like Tigringa. Yeah, I can never quite say that right. And different languages, but then we encourage that special music in that form, and then we can read the English translation of it as it's being sung.
Yeah.
And that also ministers to the people in the congregation from that language background, and it opens our world to see and worship with them.
You talk a little bit briefly about the leadership thing. Let's talk a little bit about this. Your church is different than most churches. What I mean that when you started your church in mind from the first step to bring other ethnicities into leadership. But some other churches that they welcome immigrants, they welcome refugees, we love to have you in our pulpit, we love to have you in our congregation, you come, but when it comes to the leadership, then you don't see much. that I go to different churches. I see two challenges. One is that some of the churches is completely white, one color. Congregation is one color. And the other is that some other churches where they have different ethnicities, different backgrounds, but it's still there is no leadership. There is no involvement in the leadership. Could you explain into that?
Yeah, that would be what I would call the glass ceiling. So, I mean, that term was used in the workforce often about women in the workforce that could not advance past a certain level of management. But the same thing is true in churches where you have people from different ethnic background who love the Lord, have knowledge of the Scripture. They're godly people who have a walk with God that's sincere and true, but they're never invited into leadership, and that's the glass ceiling that they hit. And I think that that's really sad, because then the church doesn't hear their viewpoint, the administration decisions of the church, the direction of the church, the vision of the church is limited to one ethnic group. And in this case, we're often speaking of European white people who haven't integrated and allowed others to be part of the leadership team, and to see them as equal. And I think maybe, just maybe, part of it is a form of bias that's in them that they're not dealing with, that they need to stop and go, you know, that culture is equal to my culture. And that's one of the things that's so important to me, is that we see equality among ourselves. We're equal. I'm not below the people that are our church, and I'm not above them. I'm equal, and we have equal perspective, and so that needs to be seen in leadership and expressed in leadership.
What about here is another one. It's about trust issue. There might be also the trust issue. What I have experienced, even in some churches, even the leadership, if they want to bring some ethnic people to their leadership, but still they are dealing with the board, they are dealing with the congregation. And if the congregation is older, Caucasian, in the leadership congregation, then it's almost impossible to bring another ethnic person to the leadership.
Yeah, and that's where we did have the advantage of planting the church from the start as an intentionally intercultural church. Brian Syme, an author,
I know him,
you know Brian. Brian has actually developed materials to help churches transition to the intercultural model. Brian is actually one of the strongest advocates of the intentionally intercultural church, and there are printed materials to help a church transition over to that.
That's very good. What are some practical things that all Canadian Christians can do right now to better reflect this model of deep biblical integration?
Well, like we were saying earlier, mixed leadership. I'm just thinking now of our ladies committee at City Church. We have people from maybe 4 or 5 different cultures on our committee.
Which cultures?
So Congolese and Filipino and Eritrean. Well, not anymore, but too many children at home couldn't afford the time. But Caucasian, and what else do we have? Punjabi consultation. So when we have events, then they become the spokespeople for their people, and so then those events can become successful. They can invite their people, and so for example, we have a ladies' retreat coming up. We're going to Kenora next weekend, and there's 40 of us going, taking the boat on the MS Kenora. And it's a highlight of the year for these ladies, and they're from many different cultures, probably about 8 cultures coming. And so this is a very bonding event. We go out all day, and that we make friendships through conversation on the bus, or through, we always have a worship time together and prayer time together, and that sustains us in our relationships for a long time, this kind of event. But it's because the leadership, they do their part in inviting their people, and it's just much more successful that way.
And they help form the event too, right? And, and they're part of forming what you're going to do. And
actually, it was a Congolese lady who had asked for this for quite a few years.
To go to Kenora.
To go to Kenora, Usually we just go to farmers markets in the area or whatever, but
Well, that's great. Yes. Let's talk a couple minutes about the teenagers as well, or children. How you integrate them into your church, into the.
I would say we haven't done fantastic on it. It's been at times challenging.
We did better in the past.
We've done better in the past, depending on who the youth worker is. If the youth worker has the intercultural model in mind, right now we have a really great youth worker that does catch it and is trying.
And she's of another culture.
Right, she's from another culture. So really, I would say the youth worker has to have the vision of it, and if you end up with a youth worker that doesn't, then it can fall apart, and the youth can kind of end up congregating to their own ethnic cliques, so to speak. So it takes really intentional thinking on the youth leader's part.
Yeah, because sometimes it can also the teenagers, like immigrant teenagers, or they also can experience some challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
In the churches. What I would say, like in a school, people cannot say that, like for example, my kids, they cannot say to my kids that they are Afghans. Because it's prohibited, yes? They cannot, it's against the rules and laws. But in a church, when people say it, then what they do?
Right.
It is a little bit of a challenge there, and that it is unfortunately happening. Sometimes I say probably the churches are behind at least 10 years in terms of deep biblical integration than the society.
Yeah, and I'd say that's so tragic, because the church should be modeling what unity is. And that was Christ's prayer in John 17, that we would be unified, and that the world may believe because of our unity. And so I think
what you are saying is the church should be ahead of society.
It should be ahead,
but it's
yes,
behind.
Behind, yeah.
Then
and so,
what is your message to the pastors, to the church leaders, to ministry leaders?
I would say, bring up to leadership those who are godly, gifted people who qualify, but are of different ethnic backgrounds, and let them be in that leadership. And then show the unity of that love, have a relationship that's deep and abiding among each other. Not a board level, like a corporate board where you sit around a board table, make decisions, pass motions, say, I second this, I move this. Not that kind of a relationship.
So deep.
But a deep relationship of come to my house, let's eat together, I'll come to your house, let's go camping together, let's spend time together, let's integrate our lives together. And then that's the kind of unity that begins, that if we can model, that the world doesn't see, because I think we can surpass what we're seeing the world do if we could just take it to that level.
Yeah. You're also beginning a program of mentoring some of these young men to become leaders.
That's very important. Mentoring. You're doing that?
Yes, we are identifying leaders and mentoring and discipling. And discipleship is such an important part of the whole process, because Christ didn't call us to make converts, he called us to make disciples. And so we're attempting to make disciples of many of the different groups, and then also move them into leadership as well when they're qualified.
Yeah, here is another thing from my life. Like, we have some friends that were part of our life, our family life, for the last 23 years since we came to Canada. And we came to Canada, I started an entry-level job, kind of, all challenges that any immigrants, refugee goes. We went through it. I started working after 2 weeks, came to Canada. We never received any government or church sponsorship or anything. And my wife started after a couple months. And one of the things that challenges that we have is some of those friends that they saw us 20 years ago, when we meet them now, somehow we think that they are still, their mindset is 20 years ago.
Oh.
They say, "Oh, Shoaib, do you remember that you work in that grocery store? Do you remember how you speak English? Or do you remember that you couldn't drive?"
Right.
That things.
Right.
Is it a cultural or I couldn't figure out why it's a kind of a basically what they're. I'm not saying in a bad way, but in a way they are saying kind of a they wanted to point me to that. How difficult that time. What's your explanation would be? Because you will know better than.
Maybe just a bonding technique. You have common memories. Like we all do that sometimes. We share things from the past because those are special beginnings in our relationship.
Yeah.
But it may be other things too. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for them, but it could be that they have fond memories, that they love that time of getting to know you, and they may be just reflecting on that and trying to connect with you on that. Yeah.
Here is a difference, and the difference is that for you that, but for me, it speaks, communicates some kind of a stereotype.
Right,
Oh,
right,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I can see that, and I think that's where
It kept you in a box. So you're not.
it's
Exactly.
putting you in a box.
That they
Yeah.
do not
Right,
know that,
right.
like our family, we grow, we
Right.
everything, but they want to keep us in that box.
Right.
That's kind of a stereotype for me.
Yeah, and that's something that I think that you raise a very good point. We need to be very careful of, and appreciate that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It is important, yeah.
Oh, very
that,
important. And I think the greater conversation needs to be, what are you doing today, and tell us about that, and
Yeah.
Dreams for the
and
future.
what are your dreams for the future, and yeah.
Or I was training volunteers to work with the refugees and immigrants for years, and or even sometimes pastors, and they say, what is the worst question to ask a refugee, an immigrant? And I usually say the worst question is to ask him, where are you from?
Oh.
And they get shocked. Why? Because we want to know, where are you from?
Right.
Like usually, like people, when I meet people on the street, or when the first question they ask, where are you from? And then my answer is, I am from Canada. And they get shocked. Yeah, their eyes get rolled, and they say, no. They think you're not from Canada. I said, if you mean where I was born, I say I was born in Afghanistan.
Right.
And then I usually ask, where are you from? And they say, oh, that's another good question for me, because I was born here. My parents were born here.
Right.
I said, no. Tell me your grandparents, where you came from, Europe or somewhere, Russia, Ukraine.
Right.
Because here in Canada, only indigenous people are in this land. All the rest come out for 100 years, came from outside Canada.
Right.
And also, when I say that, where are you from, is kind of that segregation. What basically you are telling that person in the beginning that he is not part of this country.
Kind of like us, them
Right.
mentality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why I say this is the worst question to ask, where are you from? It's better to ask, where have you been born?
Right.
Where you were raised.
Right.
You were raised in Steinbach, or you were raised in Afghanistan, or in Africa, or whatever. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Yeah, that makes total sense, complete sense. And because we are, you're right. I mean, I can look at my ancestors. My ancestors came from Sweden and Denmark and the Czech Republic, and that is where my ancestors are from. That's my history. But I am a Canadian, and and any newcomer, they're a permanent resident, then they're a Canadian, and we're equal. We're equal.
Exactly. I think it's very important to. Can we see them as equal? Can we see each other as equal in the kingdom and also in the society?
Right. Yeah. Well, we need to. It's essential. And I think we're richer for it when we do. Yeah,
here is my last question to both of you. Are there ways that the attitudes of Canadians could change to better help newcomers integrate?
Well, I think attitudes change as we get to know each other, and so we have to be very intentional about having authentic relationships and doing life together. And that's, maybe it's a slow process one by one, but in the end, it's probably the most, that it goes deeper.
Yeah, and I would say hospitality.
Yeah.
And it's opening our homes to our friends. White European people increasingly are not opening their homes. They're living in castles, in beautiful homes that are beautifully furnished, but they're not using those homes to invite people. That has to change. That has got to change. And secondly, when invited to a home, say yes and come and look forward to it, and don't be in a rush. Spend your time there.
Yeah, you mentioned it has to change. Who can change that?
Well, I think it changes with those who have been born here. They're the ones who, unfortunately, they're the gatekeeper for the most part, because they're the ones who have to open up their heart, open up their home, and give the message that we're equal and that you want a friendship with the newcomer family. I mean, the newcomer can give that message, but they're getting the message everywhere else that they're not welcome. So we have to open that message.
Probably have to be trained. Leaders need to train the congregation
to do it and to value it and not be in a rush and just to enjoy that.
Yes. That's great conversation. Yes. And if I want to answer that question, I would say we should change our perception of people. And sometimes our perception can be misleading us in a very wrong direction. Our perception about you and your perception about us, it should be godly perception, kind of from the eyes of God, how He sees people equal for the kingdom and also on earth. Thank you for this great conversation. We conclude our today's our show with the Lord's Prayer. Sue, could you lead us in Lord's Prayer today?
Sure, happy to. Thank you. Our Father who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
Square One World Media is an international team with a vision of spreading the life-changing message of Jesus Christ through media. We encourage, equip, and empower passionate Christian storytellers to share the gospel message. We spread the gospel using television, radio, podcasts, social media, and print publications. Since our first English radio program aired in 1947, we have continued to expand and now produce Christian media in a variety of formats, genres, and languages. Want to know how you can help? Go to squareoneworldmedia.com, see the projects that we're working on, and how you can get involved.